Hi, and welcome to another episode of Family Matters, the podcast that focuses on divorce and family law. Today, we have in the studio with us a firm favorite and someone you know already, Ryan Proctor. And in today's episode, we're going to take a look at child support calculators and how these can help you navigate your child support calculations successfully as you work through the divorce process. Ryan, great to have you back with us. As we get started, I wanted to know if you could please give us some insight into the key factors that are taken into account when we determine child support, and specifically in Georgia, looking at how that child support is established in any particular situation.
Under Georgia law, both parents of a child have a general duty to provide for the financial support of that child, whether there is an agreement or a court order. That obligation is not very well defined. It could constitute sending $1 a year. It could mean paying for different necessaries for the support and upbringing of that child as well. When we look at the calculation of child support within the context of a legal proceeding, the intent is to have a court order that establishes fixed terms that should be able to be relied upon so that parents can plan financially for the children. Several years ago, we used a system that merely looked at the non-custodial parents' income, took a percentage of that, and that was what was due to the primary custodial parent to assist with the financial needs of kids. Now, I have children, and I know that children are very expensive. So, what I often tell prospective clients and clients, the amount of child support that you're to receive will never be enough to pay for the kids, but every little bit counts. Uh, when we are looking at child support nowadays, we use a formula. We input certain data points into this formula. It's called a child support worksheet. And that worksheet then generates what we call a presumptive amount of support, but it's a baseline number. So there's a formula that's used. I always tell people astronauts and accountants put together this formula to determine if mom and dad are in this much money, that a child should be costing them X amount of dollars. So when we use those data points, where we start is an identification of the gross monthly income from all sources for each parent. In some instances, it's as easy as looking at a W-2 or a tax return, maybe a pay stub. In other situations, it may be far more complicated. And sources of income can vary from salary, bonuses and commissions, dividends from investments, rental income, and there's even a line item for lottery winnings, believe it or not. So we have to work hard to try to verify what the true gross monthly income is for each parent, and we start with that. That can be calculated in different ways depending on how people are paid. From there, again, the formula will work its number. Another key component that we always add is for the cost of the health insurance premiums associated with the child's coverage. And that may be Peach Care or Medicaid. It may be employer sponsored. It may also be something that was just purchased off of the open market. But that is a cost that will go into the formula. And that cost is then generally added to the presumptive amount, which is based on incomes, and allocated on a pro rata basis based on the parents' incomes. So in an example where one parent earns $4,000 a month and the other earns $1,000 a month, that $100 per month health insurance premium would be allocated, one parent being responsible for 80% and the other being responsible for 20%. So a child support payment exists in two basic forms. One we call direct child support, and the other we call indirect child support. The direct child support is going to be a monthly payment from one parent to the other, almost always from the non-custodial parent to the custodial parent. That custodial parent is More likely than not, providing somewhere between 50 and 100% of that child's day-to-day expenses. And when we think about it, children don't just need food and clothing, but they use water, they use soap, they uh, participate in the use of electricity and other utilities in the home. So that direct monthly payment, once it's calculated, is meant to contribute towards the cost that a parent is incurring on a day-to-day basis. Child support also exists in the form of what we call indirect child support. Indirect child support is a method to pay for other things that come up for kids. By way of example, there will be medical expenses that are not covered by insurance, co-pays, deductibles, pharmacy, out-of-network costs, and those need to be accounted for. Children also have daycare. They have after-school programs. They have band lessons and soccer and all manner of other activities that they participate in. So those expenses can be variable. Children that are 3 and 4 will most likely be in a daycare program, but once they get to be 5 or 6, they're probably in a more traditional school setting, possibly with after-school program. But the cost of daycare is usually significantly higher than after-school program. Or a child may not be involved in an activity one year, but the next year those costs may be $500. So with expenses like doctor bills, activities, and childcare, which are variable, then we usually come up with a system to pay those as they come in some fashion. So mom might pay for the enrollment costs for soccer. She would then send dad a copy of that invoice and her proof of payment. And then dad would be responsible to reimburse mom for his portion. We commonly see 50-50 split on those kinds of expenses. We also see a pro rata split, which would be calculated based on the parents' respective incomes. So that could be, in the example I used before, 80% by one parent and 20% by the other.
What happens in a situation where you've got a child that possibly does has an activity that that traditionally that they've been taking part in? Let's say they're in a gymnastics program, and it's something that's serious. It's competitive. They are heading towards you know, pursuing that possibly even as a profession one day. And there are obviously expenses incurred with that. What happens in a situation where the one parent is determined or adamant that this needs to go forward and this is something the child needs to do, and the other parent's going, well, this is very expensive. It's something that I don't feel I can contribute towards. It's not a necessity for their care. It's not it's not something that makes up their basic care. And as an additional item, and it could relate to so many different things. As an additional item, I just feel I can't contribute to that financially. What happens in a situation like that?
Well, it will depend to some extent on what the parties may have agreed to do previously, and that would be in the form of some kind of a support arrangement. But the decisions about what activities a child will participate in is a function of the legal custody of the child. So an example may be mom wants a child to have band lessons, but the father would prefer that there be soccer instead. The legal custody decision-making process would then dictate which of those parents has the authority to make the final decision. And if that's mom, her decision may well be to proceed with the band lessons or music lessons. But if dad has that authority, or it's his turn to have that authority or his portion of the year, then the dad's decision would control. And what you get as a result is one parent potentially obligating another parent financially for that decision. And I can tell you that competitive cheerleading and fall soccer league are very different expenses. And so what we would need to look at in that regard, is there a prior arrangement that requires it? And what kind of terms then could have been or need to be negotiated and considered or asked to be put in place by a judge in order to place some kind of control over that? And what I tend to do, and what I see many of my colleagues do, is put a limit on the financial exposure that one parent can place on the other, specifically for extracurricular activities. But we also sometimes apply that to childcare expenses or summer camps as well. With medical expenses, that's a bit different. The cost of a certain procedure or course of treatment shouldn't dictate whether or not a child receives that. Uh, so, an example might be mom and dad agree that they are going to share in the costs of the child's extracurricular activities on an equal basis, but neither party will be required to contribute more than $2,000 per calendar year toward those costs. So if mom is the decision maker and the traveling band and the associated camps and instruments are going to cost $10,000, she can ask dad to share that with her, but his maximum contribution is that $2,000 for that year. Mom might need to think if she wants to pick up the rest of that if dad's not willing to do that.
Yeah. Okay. When it comes to children with special needs, you obviously have quite a list of additional costs and expenses that are associated with those. In a situation where you've got parents that have been raising a child with special needs, and if we go back to the example of, let's say, dad earns $4,000 a month and mom earns $1,000 a month, and you've got a mom in a situation who's facing a divorce now and looking at these expenses and these costs, what would the impact or the implication be for her in that situation versus him? So if he's got the higher income, would that still work with your percentage ratio? So 80% would be dad's responsibility, 20% would be mom's responsibility, bearing in mind that these are expenses that are so necessary to the well-being of the child who had in the situation.
Well, in that scenario, if I'm representing the higher income parent, I would prefer a 50-50 split. If I'm representing the other parent, I would want a pro rata split. I think technically the child support statute calls for a pro rata split, although we do often see judges more or less default to a 50-50 obligation. When we have those kinds of expenses for special needs, and that may be tutoring, it could be physical therapy, any number of things. There may be regularly occurring medications or other appointments and treatments that are needed as a result of that. Those expenses are likely to exist over the long term, and they may not be quite as variable as something like an extracurricular activity. And for those kinds of expenses, those indirect expenses of all kinds, those can be placed as more data into the child support calculation, and they can then serve to be divided on a pro rata basis, more or less, and then factored into the direct child support. So if we know that a child is going to have an ongoing therapeutic expense, it's $500 every month, we may go ahead and insert that into the formula and turn that into direct support. If it's not going to be variable and it is going to be consistent, that promotes a little bit easier budgeting and there's less debt collecting involved.
All right, so now we're sitting in a situation where the couple is getting divorced. You have compiled the data. We've reached an agreement on what that child support ratio and the split is going to be. How looking forward and looking at the long term, how long is that agreement in place? Is it something that's reviewed annually and increased? Is it something that the couple is going to have to renegotiate on an annual basis as costs increase? How does that work?
If there's one thing that separated or divorced families tend to argue about, it's money. And the law in Georgia very strongly favors coming up with a fixed amount of support rather than a variable amount. That direct support amount, that monthly payment, once it's set, that remains in place as a court order unless and until it is modified by another court order. The indirect expenses, which are variable, of course, those will be variable. And we do have parents that end up litigating over non-payment or reasonableness of payment towards those costs. And that can become a mechanism of contempt or enforcement. But child support will stay the same. The court wants to distance itself from the bean counting and tracking who paid what and looking at various receipts as much as possible. It's not very efficient for the legal system to deal with that kind of accounting for those kinds of disputes. So if the child support payment is set at $1,500 per month based on the then existing financial conditions, let's say then that one of the parents becomes unemployed or disabled or has some kind of loss of income, that parent would probably want to immediately investigate and then pursue a modification of that child support amount. If your income goes from $5,000 a month to nothing, your ability to pay $1,000 a month in child support may not be there, but the child support payments do not go away. And the law also says, even if the other parent says, don't worry about it, you don't need to pay, or it's okay to pay half of that amount, the law does require the full amount of the payment. And there's well-established case law, even when one parent has said, forget about it, technically that child support belongs to the child and is theoretically supposed to be used for the child. When it is not paid, neither parent can waive the child's right to have that amount of support.
I think that's such an important point, and I think that's something that most people, I didn't think of it, most people don't think of, is that child support is exactly that. It is in the best interests of the child, and is set aside for the child, and it is so important to remember that as a party in this process, you don't have the right to make a change to that agreement. You don't have the authority to say no, it's okay, don't worry about it, because at the end of the day, it, the whole purpose of it is in the best interests or for the best interests of that child, and that's such an important point to note, I think, in these situations.
I agree. And the judges that we work with take issues involving children very seriously. The mother and father most likely have attorneys to look out for their interests, but uh, a child does not. So issues about support of a child are taken very seriously, issues of arrearages, and that also most certainly applies to issues of parenting and custody as well. Judges take issues involving kids very seriously, and most family lawyers do as well, of course.
What would happen in a situation where, as you stated, there've been parents that have said, "Don't worry about it," or only pay half. What are the long-term ramifications of that situation?
So the parent who was due to receive the child support can bring an action for contempt. Contempt is a willful violation of a court order. So if the judge says, hey, pay $1,000 a month for your child support, and the parent doesn't do that, even if the other parent has said, don't worry about it, the parent that said, don't worry, can still file a contempt or an enforcement action against the paying parent and collect all of the support that was due under the child support order. So you can imagine at the rate of whether it's $500 a month or $2,500 a month, 6 months of that starts to dig you a pretty deep hole that you cannot dig out of. A judge may not determine that the parent obligated for the monthly payment is in contempt. Maybe they relied on that agreement in good faith, but the amount due is still due. And in those circumstances, the court will consider that parent's ability to pay. That's going to be based on financial circumstances. If the financial wherewithal is there to permit a lump sum payment, that may be the resolution. If it's not, we often see judges incorporate some kind of a payment plan. So in the example of the parent that went from earning $5,000 a month to $1,000, they filed a lawsuit, they've made an agreement or gotten a new judgment, but they're behind $10,000 on the old support amount. A judge might say, okay, I'm going to change your new child support. Your new payment's going to be $250. You're to pay that starting the first of next month. And then you owe $10,000 for the arrearages that accrued. and you're going to pay that back also at the rate of an additional $250 per month until it's paid in full.
Is there ever an opportunity for a child to claim that backdated support? So let's say a parent said, no, don't worry about it. A child gets to the age of 14, they're wanting to pursue a career in, I don't know, something very expensive, and they that money was due to them. Are they ever in the legal position where they could claim that money?
Possibly, yes. But the agreement or court order is applicable to the parents. And that obligation then ultimately trickles down to the child, but it's an obligation between the two parents. And what we would typically see would be the parent that didn't receive the custody, maybe for 10 years. One parent didn't pay for 10 years, and the amount that's due is $100,000. Well, what can be done? Many years ago, child support arrearages were viewed like many other debts. They would disappear after a certain amount of time and become uncollectible. Due to the importance of child support, that's been changed, and that obligation does not go away ever. We typically see the parent that was to receive that child support file to collect the arrearages, it being presumed that that parent, let's say dad had custody and mom never paid, it's presumed that dad had to pick up all of those bills on his own and merely seeking partial reimbursement from mom over what those expenses actually cost.
Okay. Let's take a look at child support and the child's age. So, looking at the agreement that's in place, we've seen that once the agreement is in place, that stays, that's standard, unless you petition to change it, and then that has to go through a process of going to court for those amendments. How long are parents responsible for, or how long are they required to pay those
Child support is designed by law to end when the child reaches what we call the age of majority. And that's generally age 18. But it could also be upon emancipation. Maybe we've got a 16-year-old that's decided to get a job and move out, no longer dependent financially upon either parent. It can be when a child joins the armed forces, in which case the military would pick up, hopefully, most of those living expenses. It could be upon marriage, and a few other things. Now, we do see children who turn 18, but they are still enrolled in high school. And if that child is continuing in high school beyond the age of 18, those monthly direct child support payments and the indirect sharing of expenses can continue until the child graduates from high school, but in no event longer than the age.
Okay, all right. Going back to our child support calculator, as that child gets older and as they start looking at college and as they start looking at, um, different interests, and I know we've said that agreement is in place from start to finish, but realistically, those expenses are going to change. Those expenses are there. There is an ebb and a flow with any growing child, and I know with my children, they're interested in something one week and that changes the next week, and we we're constantly reevaluating and reassessing where we are. How often do you see those child support agreements being brought back to a renegotiation stage? How is it something that's common practice? I think is what I'm asking. Is that something that a lot of families look at as they move forward and as children start to get older?
Sure, people's life circumstances change, and the cost and expenses of a child can change as well. We the courts don't necessarily want people coming back every 6 months to make adjustments. So there is, on a basic level, you're allowed to automatically look at the child support amount every 2 years. You are also entitled to have a court look at that amount when there has been a substantial change in circumstances. And those changes in circumstances could be an increase or decrease in either parent's income or a substantial change in the expenses and needs of the child. We would also sometimes see modification actions. Let's say there's three children, and the support is set to pay for three children. One has graduated from high school and moved on, and now we only have two children to consider. We do work to also assess and determine, do we need to make an adjustment because there are only two kids now.
Okay. Let's look at some of the tax implications. So, what are the tax considerations or the tax implications when it comes to looking at child support payments once you've got those agreements in place? How does that play out?
So, the payment, let's say mom has custody and dad's obligated to make a payment to her, that comes as a net payment to mom. Those are dad's after tax dollars. So dad has to be, when we're looking at budgeting, dad has to go out and be able to earn $1,300 or $1,500 to pay the taxes and then send that $1,000 to the mother. And so we do have to look at parties' incomes and regular expenses to try to budget and plan for these kinds of things. It is possible to ask a judge for a deviation from the presumptive amount of child support. And sometimes it is legitimate to ask for a deviation based on financial condition. Maybe, listen, I bring home $3,000 a month and I have to pay that all out. I don't have $800 more for child support. But again, judges are interested in protecting children and making sure they're supported. The judge is going to have that parent cut out the trips to McDonald's, haircuts, and things like that. From that, you're going to have to trim a lot of fat from the budget to be able to have a judge consider a financial burden deviation or discount.
Okay. All right. So if we take a look at the child support calculator, so I know that as a mom, if I was to come and knock on your door and say, we're facing a divorce at the moment, first of all, that's scary to start with. And I've got my beautiful babies that, I want to look after and shield and protect and make sure that they are provided for and that we're okay. And you mentioned child support calculator to me and my blood runs cold because for me, that sounds so impersonal. What reassurances can you give me that this is actually the right way to go and that the system that's in place is fair and that although yes, it doesn't sound like there's a lot of emotion in this, that's actually to my benefit. So if you know what I'm asking.
Sure. Well, when families are separating, and a lot of times we're looking at two incomes or even one income that was supporting the whole family. And now we've got to try to find a way, and this is often our biggest challenge. How do we make that same amount of money pay for two homes instead of one? And for people that have children, making sure that there's this, for people that have children, trying to make sure the child isn't impacted as much is an important factor. There are going to be changes, but we want to have as much continuity as we can for that child because so many other big changes are happening. They may be having to change schools, looking at new friends, not being able to participate in some of the things that they used to participate in. And then we're also looking at parents who are already on a tight budget trying to figure that out. So there is a lot of stress involved in payment of child support, and then also that child support's, like I said before, that child support amount's not going to be enough to cover everything. But it's not the child's burden. It's not the child's responsibility to be burdened by that. And it's going to take cuts in budget. We do have people that will need to go out and look at second jobs or different jobs to try to earn more money in order to meet the financial obligations of living independently and having.
And I suppose it becomes quite a complex issue because if you're looking at traditionally what was a stay-at-home mom who now has to go out and earn an income, she's been there at home with those children. So there wasn't an expense of after school care. There wasn't those weren't expenses that needed to be factored in previously. Those I'm assuming would now all form part of that calculation that you're going to put together. So yes, we've got dad and this is what he earns. Mom's going to have to get a job, but we've got two small children at home. So they need care during that time, and that comes with a cost as well. But that would then be factored into those calculations.
That's right. Things the child care, the summer camps, the activities, the doctor bills, those things can be factored in, and they should be accounted for. When we look at child support, when the agreement or order says, "Hey, listen, mom, you are to pay dad for these things," everything else technically falls on then dad as the custodial parent to pay for it, and mom doesn't have to contribute towards the costs of auto insurance, a cellular telephone, school yearbook, field trip fees, or private school tuition, for that example, unless the order or agreement says that mom has to share in that obligation. So, school supplies and clothing fall under that same umbrella. But everything is more expensive these days. The cost of living has increased, the cost of goods have increased, and we're seeing that a lot of times people's earnings are really not keeping up with that. And so it is difficult and it's daunting. Let's say that we have the mother who has stayed at home with the child, and now she's got expenses to pay. It's hard to get by with the child on a monthly budget of anything less than $3,000 or so. The child support is we use that formula and we use the data to come up with that amount, but that's not going to meet the monthly bills for a single parent household. So we do have to look at helping people find ways to earn money. Sometimes people have to also look at state sponsored resources like Peach Care or Medicaid in lieu of private insurance. There is also assistance for families in need that can be applied for. But the function of paying the expenses of the child is the function of child support. Helping a spouse to get on their own feet financially, whether that's to get back into the workforce, to obtain some level of education or training to get into the workforce, or just to be in a position to go out and find a job, is more a function of spousal support than child support.
I think what I'm learning through this discussion is that when it comes when it comes to these calculations and it comes to putting a plan in place, the benefits of the systematic approach with the calculations for me is actually quite reassuring because there's certain things that maybe I have not factored in. I've got so much going through my mind at the moment. I'm facing a divorce. I'm facing a change in living circumstances. I'm looking at all these very real things that are in front of me. I'm not thinking of how much the utility bill is going to be, and I'm not thinking of the extra after school activities, and I'm not thinking of those types of things and how I can put that plan together that it's going to work as best as possible in our situation. And I think that there's so much benefit in that, as cold as what it sounds, because it does. It sounds very scary, a child support calculation process. But I think the absolute structure of it is so reassuring that from A to B to C, all the way down, this is the data that we're using. And from that data, this is the plan that we're going to be able to draw. And from that plan that we can draw, we can see if there's any gaps and we can start to address those. And there's such a reassurance in that.
That is correct. And having that formula allows us to some extent, streamline that process. Now, we may have arguments over what someone's income is or what an actual cost is for a certain expense of the child. But once we get into that formula and we've got a baseline amount, we can then negotiate from there based on specific needs for a family. It doesn't leave everything up to argument. It gives us a path to follow, and that path is designed to be fair in that it requires contributions from both parents it considers their respective incomes, and it allows us to look more in specific detail at the costs of healthcare and the normal expenses that a child will have on a day-to-day basis. It gives us a very good roadmap. It's aimed to reduce the tension that we see and the arguments that we might see people pursue. But having representation and considering things that are going on is also going to be very helpful for a parent. Yes, they're going to be disoriented and distracted. And we need to think about things like the possibility of including funding for college, the possibilities of including payment for things like college preparatory courses or college application fees, or maybe just the cost of attending a prom. Those aren't things that we always see factored into the payment of child support, but if it's not in the agreement, it's not required. And so for certain families, we will look at those kinds of things, plan and budget for them, and try to make sure we get an appropriate contribution from each parent for these kinds of things that may come up.
Ryan, is there any additional advice that you'd like to give to parents that are starting this journey at the moment?
For any family that's heading into a situation like this, where we need to be looking at separating everything, just not just households, but furniture, bills, insurance coverage, time with the child, expenses for a child, all of that. We need to have information, and information is key. So it would behoove a parent that's looking at not just a child support issue, but maybe a separation or a divorce, to start to gather certain financial records. Tax returns, pay stubs are excellent resources to get a head start on determining incomes and scenarios. And we can oftentimes, even during initial consultation, based on our experience, we've all family lawyers like me have looked at thousands of people's budgets in all kinds of scenarios. So we should all have a pretty good feel for what things cost based on where people live and what they make and what they do. And we can help to craft a budget, even with some very basic information. What do things look like now for this family intact? What do things look like at the end for a parent and for a child? And having access to things like retirement statements, car loans, utility bills, being able to sketch out a budget right away is going to help us start to be able to estimate what can we start to think about in the way of child support. For the parent that's going to pay, that's going to be another expense that's added to their list of expenses. For the parent who's going to receive that, how far is that going to go towards paying for what a child needs on a day-to-day basis? And where do we need to look at potentially to try to identify other resources? Do we need a second job? Do we need to be looking in this particular community to relocate instead of that one based on the cost of living? So even having that basic information up front can start us, whether working with an attorney or not with an attorney, you need to start thinking about those things and planning for them. That data is important, and looking at what options are going to be for you in the future are important. It's easy enough to say, well, sure, there's a house down the street and I can buy that house. But we've got to look at that. Do we have the money to finance that home? Do we have the money to pay for those bills at that house? And so is that even a realistic outcome? So where do we need to go to stay in school district, first and foremost? And can we build a budget that's going to finance that? So looking at where you may want to live is good, but where you may be able to live is also important as well.